there's a version of this story where you don't exist. Not you specifically, all of us. Every human being alive today. Every person who has ever read a book or written a poem or looked up at the stars and wondered. Every civilization, every language, every song, every war, every act of love or cruelty or ordinary Tuesday morning coffee. All of it. Gone. Not in the future, in the past. Erased before any of it happened by a catastrophe so total, so relentless, and so geologically recent that if it had gone just slightly differently, the dominant intelligent species on Earth right now would not be us. Would not be anything like us. Would be, almost certainly, nothing at all. Or at best, some unrecognizable descendant of the handful of broken, frightened creatures who made it through by the narrowest margin in evolutionary history. Here is the claim at the center of this video, and I want to say it plainly before we get into the evidence. The current scientific consensus is that at some point, roughly 70,000 to 100,000 years ago, the entire human population of the Earth was reduced to somewhere between a few hundred and a few thousand individuals. Not a few million, not a few 100,000. A few thousand people? Perhaps fewer. Some estimates put the effective breeding population at the time of our worst bottleneck at fewer than 1,000 individuals. For context, there are more than 1,000 people in a typical large shopping mall on a Saturday afternoon. That is the thread by which your existence and the existence of every person you have ever loved or despised or passed on the street without noticing was hanging. We did not go fully extinct. Obviously, you are here. But the question of whether we already went extinct once is less crazy than it might initially sound, because what nearly happened to our species was, by any reasonable biological standard, a functional extinction event, the kind that has wiped out lineages far more numerous, far more widely distributed, and far more ecologically robust than early Homo sapiens were. Let me be clear about something before we go further. I'm not using extinction loosely or metaphorically. Biologists define extinction as the termination of a lineage, the point at which no living individuals remain. We did not technically go extinct. But in conservation biology, there is a concept called the minimum viable population, the smallest population size at which a species retains the demographic and genetic resources to survive and recover from catastrophe. Most estimates put the minimum viable population for a mammal at several hundred to several thousand individuals, and that's under favorable conditions. Below that threshold, a species is considered functionally doomed. It may limp on for a few more generations, but random events, a bad drought, a pathogen, a few seasons of reproductive failure, will finish it off. The human population of 70,000 years ago may have been at or below that threshold, not for a generation or two, possibly for tens of thousands of years. That is not a near miss. That is a near extinction. And the fact that it didn't become an actual extinction was not inevitable. It was, in the precise technical sense of the word, a contingency, a matter of chance. What hit us? What was the catastrophe? How do we know it happened when there was nobody left to write it down? And what does it mean for who we are, for why we think the way we think, for the haunted, tribal, catastrophe-shaped psychology that we carry around in our skulls to this day? That every single human being alive is descended from a population that was almost nothing. These are not abstract questions. The answers live in our DNA. They live in our psychology. They live in the genetic similarities and differences between populations that scientists have spent the last 3 decades mapping with instruments of extraordinary precision. And what those instruments have found is a story that is far more harrowing, far more strange, and far more relevant to the present moment than most people realize. Let's go. Chapter 1. The concept of a genetic bottleneck. Before we get to the specific catastrophe or catastrophes in human history, I want to make sure we're on the same page about the biological concept that underpins everything we're going to discuss. It's called a population bottleneck, and it's one of the most important and counterintuitive ideas in all of evolutionary biology. Here's the basic concept. Imagine a species, any species, that has been around for a long time and has built up a large, diverse population. Over thousands of generations, random mutations have accumulated throughout the gene pool. Different individuals carry different versions of the same genes. These are called alleles. And the diversity of alleles in a population is a direct reflection of its history. A population that has been large and stable for a long time will have many different alleles at each genetic locus. A population that has been through repeated crashes will have fewer. Now imagine that catastrophe strikes. Disease, climate change, a volcanic eruption, a prolonged drought. Whatever the cause, the population crashes suddenly and dramatically. Instead of millions of individuals, you're down to thousands. Instead of thousands, you're down to hundreds. The survivors carry with them only a fraction of the genetic diversity that existed before the crash. The rare alleles, the uncommon variants that existed in only a small percentage of the original population, are likely to have been lost entirely, carried by individuals who didn't survive. The common alleles persist, but even they are now represented by far fewer individuals. This is the bottleneck, a sudden compression of genetic diversity, as if the gene pool were a river forced through a narrow canyon. The diversity on the other side is smaller than it was going in. Some things survive, many things are lost forever. And here's the critical point. After the bottleneck, even if the population recovers completely, even if it bounces back to its previous size or exceeds it, the genetic diversity never fully recovers. Not on human timescales. Not on timescales of tens of thousands of years. The diversity was in those individuals who didn't survive, and those individuals are gone. Their genes are gone. The genetic variability that would have provided the raw material for adaptation to future environments, gone. You can see evidence of population bottlenecks written clearly in the genomes of living species. Cheetahs are a famous example. Modern cheetahs are so genetically uniform that you can skin graft between unrelated individuals without rejection, a feat impossible in nearly any other mammal. This is the legacy of a severe population bottleneck, probably occurring around 10,000 years ago, which compressed cheetah genetic diversity to a tiny fraction of what it must have been before. Cheetahs today are essentially a clonal population in genetic terms, extremely vulnerable to novel diseases and environmental changes because they simply don't have the genetic variation to mount diverse responses. Northern elephant seals went through a bottleneck in the 19th century when hunting nearly drove them to extinction. The population crashed to perhaps 20 individuals. Today, there are 170,000 northern elephant seals, a remarkable recovery in numbers. But the genetic diversity never came back. They are all, genetically speaking, almost identical. One bad virus, one novel pathogen, and the entire species could go. Now, here's what makes the human case so astonishing. When geneticists began mapping the human genome in the 1990s and 2000s, comparing DNA across human populations from around the world, they expected to find rich genetic diversity, the product of a species that had been around for 200,000 to 300,000 years and had spread across multiple continents. What they found instead was that Homo sapiens is, by the standards of the animal kingdom, an extraordinarily genetically uniform species. A single troop of chimpanzees in West Africa, a few dozen individuals living in a patch of forest, contains more genetic diversity than the entire human species. More than 7 billion people, more genetic diversity in 40 chimpanzees. That finding, when geneticists first confirmed it in the 1990s, produced a kind of stunned quiet in the field. We had expected Homo sapiens, a species of staggering ecological range distributed across every continent except Antarctica, adapted to environments from tropical rainforest to Arctic tundra, to show the genetic signature of that diversity. We expected a rich, deep gene pool. What we found was the opposite. The numbers are worth dwelling on. Across the entire human species, the average difference between any two randomly selected human genomes is about 0.1%. That sounds like a small number, and in absolute terms, it is. There are about 3 billion base pairs in the human genome. So 0.1% represents about 3 million individual differences. But in comparative terms, it is striking. The genetic difference between any two humans is roughly 4 to 5 times smaller than the genetic difference between any two chimpanzees picked at random. It is smaller than the difference between gorillas from the same population. It is smaller than the genetic diversity within many other single mammalian species that we would never think of as particularly uniform. The standard evolutionary explanation for this would be that Homo sapiens is a young species, that we simply haven't had time to accumulate much genetic diversity yet. But that doesn't quite work either, because even for our age, our diversity is low. Other species of comparable or shorter evolutionary age show considerably more genetic variation. The data doesn't just say young species. It says young species that went through something catastrophic. That is what a genetic bottleneck looks like. That is what a genetic bottleneck looks like. Now here's the critical point. Population bottlenecks are not merely of historical interest. They have consequences that echo through evolutionary time. A species that has lost genetic diversity is more vulnerable to future threats, less able to adapt rapidly to novel pathogens, to climate shifts, to environmental changes it has never encountered before. The diversity that was lost in the bottleneck was the raw material of future adaptation, and it is gone. You can see evidence of population bottlenecks written clearly in the genomes of living species. Cheetahs are a famous example. Modern cheetahs are so genetically uniform that you can skin graft between unrelated individuals without rejection, a feat impossible in nearly any other mammal. This is the legacy of a severe population bottleneck, probably occurring around 10,000 years ago, which compressed cheetah genetic diversity to to a tiny fraction of what it must have been before. Cheetahs today are essentially a clonal population in genetic terms, extremely vulnerable to novel diseases and environmental changes because they simply don't have the genetic variation to mount diverse responses. Northern elephant seals went through a bottleneck in the 19th century when hunting nearly drove them to extinction. The population crashed to perhaps 20 individuals. Today, there are 170,000 northern elephant seals, a remarkable recovery in numbers. But the genetic diversity never came back. They are all, genetically speaking, almost identical. One bad virus, one novel pathogen, and the entire species could go. Now here's what makes the human case so astonishing. When geneticists began mapping the human genome in the 1990s and 2000s, comparing DNA across human populations from around the world, they expected to find rich genetic diversity, the product of a species that had been around for 200,000 to 300,000 years and had spread across multiple continents. What they found instead was that Homo sapiens is, by the standards of the animal kingdom, an extraordinarily genetically uniform species. A single troop of chimpanzees in West Africa, a few dozen individuals living in a patch of forest, contains more genetic diversity than the entire human species. And it can only be explained by one thing. At some point in the recent past, the human population crashed so severely that the vast majority of human genetic diversity was erased. We are all, in genetic terms, the children of a small group of survivors. The question is, what happened to the ones who didn't survive? Chapter 2. Reading the past in our DNA. The science that has allowed us to reconstruct the population history of our species from living DNA is relatively young. It emerged fully only in the 1990s, but it has advanced with extraordinary speed, and its findings are now robust enough to be considered established science rather than speculation. The core tool is mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA. Here's why mitochondrial DNA is so useful for tracing deep ancestry. Every cell in your body contains hundreds or thousands of mitochondria, the organelles that generate energy by metabolizing oxygen. Mitochondria have their own DNA, separate from the nuclear DNA in the cell's nucleus, and that mitochondrial DNA is inherited exclusively from your mother. Not a mix of mother and father, only from your mother, who inherited it from her mother, who inherited it from her mother, all the way back. Because mitochondrial DNA is not shuffled by recombination the way nuclear DNA is, it mutates slowly and predictably over time, accumulating changes at a relatively constant rate. This makes it act like a molecular clock. By comparing the mitochondrial DNA sequences of different people and counting the number of mutations that separate them, you can estimate how far back in time their maternal lineages diverged. When geneticists mapped the mitochondrial DNA of people from populations around the world, from every continent, from isolated indigenous groups that had been geographically separated for tens of thousands of years, from populations with very different histories and ancestries, they found something remarkable. All human mitochondrial DNA traces back to a single woman, not metaphorically, literally. All 7 billion people alive today share a common maternal ancestor who lived approximately 150,000 to 200,000 years ago in Africa. She has a name in the popular literature, Mitochondrial Eve. Now, mitochondrial Eve is often misunderstood. She was not the only woman alive at the time. There were plenty of other women, but all of their mitochondrial lineages eventually went extinct. Through random chance, or because they had no daughters, or because their descendants died out. Only her mitochondrial lineage survived. She is the most recent common ancestor in the maternal line. The parallel finding for the Y chromosome, which is inherited exclusively from father to son, is Y chromosomal Adam, the most recent common ancestor in the paternal line, estimated to have lived approximately 200,000 to 340,000 years ago. The existence of mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosomal Adam is consistent with a species that has passed through severe population reductions. In a large, stable, diverse population, multiple lineages persist for millions of years. In a species that has repeatedly crashed to very small numbers, those crashes act as genetic sieves, eliminating most lineages. The further back you trace the surviving lineages, the more they converge. And the speed of that convergence tells you something about how small the population got and how recently. Beyond mitochondrial DNA, the development of high-throughput genome sequencing in the 2000s and 2010s allowed geneticists to analyze variation across the entire nuclear genome. They developed statistical techniques, particularly a method called the pairwise sequentially Markovian coalescent, or PSMC, that could estimate the population size of a species at different points in the past, based on the pattern of genetic diversity in a single individual's genome. When applied to humans, these analyses converge on a consistent picture. The ancestral population of Homo sapiens was never very large, reached a severe minimum at some point between 70,000 and 100,000 years ago, and then began to expand. The minimum population, the deepest point of the bottleneck, was in the range of 1,000 to 10,000 effective individuals, with several analyses clustering around 1,000 to 3,000. Effective population size is a technical term that means something slightly different from the raw count of living individuals. It accounts for differences in reproductive success. Not everyone breeds equally, and for the fact that genetic diversity is determined more by the number of breeding individuals than the total number alive. An effective population size of 1,000 could correspond to a total population of several thousand to perhaps 10,000, depending on the breeding structure. But even on the most optimistic interpretation, we are talking about a population that was tiny. Alarmingly, historically, catastrophically tiny. What is particularly striking is the consistency of this signal across different modern populations. Researchers have applied the PSMC and related analyses to genome data from hundreds of individuals, representing populations from every inhabited continent. From the San people of southern Africa, among the most ancient human lineages, to indigenous Australians, to populations from Europe, East Asia, and the Americas. All of them carry the signature of this ancient bottleneck. The timing and depth differ slightly depending on which population you analyze. Some analyses suggest that African populations show a somewhat shallower bottleneck than non-African populations, consistent with the out of Africa model in which the non-African founding population passed through an additional bottleneck when humans first left the continent. But the fundamental signal is universal. Every human lineage traces back through a period of severe population reduction. There is a kind of grim democracy in that finding. The genetic ancestors of the Tibetan Highlander and the Amazon rainforest dweller and the Norwegian fisherman and the San hunter-gatherer all passed through the same ancient near-extinction event. We are, beneath all our surface diversity, the children of a shared catastrophe. The question that haunted paleoanthropologists and geneticists for the first decade after this finding was, what could have caused such a dramatic reduction in the human population? What happened around 70,000 to 100,000 years ago that brought our species to the very edge of oblivion? One answer has dominated the discussion for 3 decades, and it comes from 73,000 years ago in what is now the Indonesian island of Sumatra. Chapter 3: The Sky Goes Dark, Toba. 74,000 years ago, the volcano that would one day be known as Toba erupted. And the word erupted does not come close to capturing what happened. The Toba event, formally designated a super eruption, the most violent class of volcanic activity known to science, released approximately 2,800 cubic kilometers of magma. That number needs context. The 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens, which killed 57 people, flattened hundreds of square miles of forest, and dominated global news coverage for weeks, released about 1 cubic kilometer. The 1991 eruption of Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines, one of the largest volcanic eruptions of the 20th century, which temporarily lowered global temperatures by about 0.5 degrees Celsius, released about 10 cubic kilometers. Toba released 2,800 cubic kilometers. It was the largest known volcanic eruption on Earth in the last 2 million years, possibly in the last 27 million years. The eruption left behind a caldera, the collapsed crater formed by the emptying of the magma chamber. That is today Lake Toba, the largest volcanic lake in the world, 100 kilometers long and 30 kilometers wide. The immediate physical effects of an eruption of this scale are staggering. The pyroclastic flows, superheated avalanches of gas and debris traveling at hundreds of kilometers per hour, would have devastated everything within several hundred kilometers of the eruption. But the pyroclastic flows are almost the least of it, because their reach, while enormous by any ordinary measure, is ultimately local. What Toba did to the atmosphere is what mattered for the rest of the world. The eruption injected an estimated 6,000 million metric tons of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere. Sulfur dioxide in the stratosphere reacts with water vapor to form sulfate aerosols, tiny reflective particles that scatter incoming sunlight back into space. This is the mechanism behind the cooling effect of large volcanic eruptions. Pinatubo's 20 million tons of SO2 caused about half a degree of global cooling lasting 2 or 3 years. Toba injected 300 times as much. The sulfate aerosol cloud from Toba would have spread around the globe in weeks and persisted for years, dramatically reducing the amount of sunlight reaching the Earth's surface. The resulting volcanic winter is estimated to have lasted between 3 and 10 years, with significant cooling persisting for decades beyond that. Some estimates suggest average global temperatures dropped by 10 to 15 degrees Celsius during the most acute phase of the eruption's aftermath. In northern latitudes and at altitude, the cooling may have been even more extreme. What does a 10-degree global temperature drop for several years do to the biosphere? In a word, devastates it. Plants die in the cold and the dark. Herbivores dependent on those plants starve. Carnivores dependent on those herbivores starve. The food chains that support ecosystems don't just wobble, they shatter at every link simultaneously. Forests die back. Grasslands shrink to scattered remnants. Water sources freeze at latitudes that had never frozen before. This is what early Homo sapiens woke up into one morning about 74,000 years ago, without any understanding of what had happened or any ability to predict when it would end. The sky would have turned dark over days or weeks. The temperature would have dropped faster than any climate shift in living human memory. Animals that humans had relied on for food would have begun to disappear. Plant foods would have become scarce, then non-existent in many regions. We were not the only species hit by this. Every large mammal in Africa and Asia would have been devastated. Forests and grasslands across the tropics collapsed. Archaeological evidence for human presence, stone tools, butchering sites, hearths, goes essentially silent across vast regions of Asia and Africa in the period immediately following the Toba eruption. The silence in the archaeological record is one of the first pieces of evidence that something catastrophic happened. There is a notable gap, what some researchers have called the Toba Gap, in the archaeological record of Africa and southern Asia, corresponding roughly to the period following the eruption. Sites that show evidence of human occupation before the event show little or none after it, and then activity resumes at lower levels tens of thousands of years later. In southern Africa, the genetic and archaeological evidence is particularly striking. A small set of sites clustered near the southern coast of Africa, where marine resources provided a buffer against the loss of terrestrial food sources, appear to have been refugia, places where human groups survived by exploiting shellfish, seabirds, and other coastal resources that were less devastated by the volcanic winter than inland environments. The coastal location was likely critical. The ocean acts as a thermal buffer, moderating temperature swings, and marine food chains are more resilient than terrestrial ones to short-term atmospheric disruptions. It was from these tiny, scattered refugia, patches of relative habitability in a world that had largely stopped working, that the survivors emerged. The descendants of those survivors eventually repopulated the continent, and then the world, and their genetic fingerprint, the reduced, compressed, bottlenecked signature of a species that had come within reach of nothingness, is still readable in the DNA of every human being alive today. Let me try to make the geography of survival concrete, because it matters deeply for understanding not just who survived, but how. The southern coast of Africa, from approximately the Western Cape east through what is now KwaZulu-Natal, sits at a convergence of ocean systems that is essentially unique on the planet. The cold Benguela Current runs northward along the western coast, and the warm Agulhas Current sweeps southward and then eastward along the eastern and southern coasts. Where these systems interact, the result is one of the most productive marine environments on Earth. Rich in shellfish, fish, sea mammals, seabirds, and other resources that are available year-round, and are relatively insensitive to the kind of atmospheric cooling that devastates terrestrial food chains. The people who ended up in this refugium were not there by plan. There was no committee that decided to send the survivors to the coast. They were probably there already, exploiting coastal resources as one component of a broader subsistence strategy. When the interior collapsed, when the grasslands that supported game animals dried or froze, when the plant foods that supplemented the diet disappeared, the people on the coast had something the people inland didn't: a marine food chain that kept working. The coastline itself also provided a degree of climatic buffering. Ocean temperatures change more slowly than air temperatures over land. The coastal margin is warmer in winter and cooler in summer than the interior. During a volcanic winter that might have made the African interior deeply hostile to human survival, the coastal fringe maintained conditions closer to what humans could tolerate. And critically, the shellfish didn't care about volcanic winter. Mussels and limpets and whelks filter food from the water column or graze on intertidal algae, processes that continue regardless of what's happening in the stratosphere. They were there, accessible at low tide, available in predictable places at predictable times, requiring no tools beyond a rock to dislodge them and hands to collect them. They were exactly the right food for a species that had lost most of its other options. It was from these tiny scattered refugia, patches of relative habitability in a world that had largely stopped working, that the survivors emerged. Chapter 4: The Case Against Toba, and what it reveals. Here's where the story gets more complicated and more interesting. The Toba catastrophe hypothesis, the specific claim that the Toba super-eruption caused the human population bottleneck, has been a central and compelling narrative in human evolutionary biology since it was first proposed by Stanley Ambrose in 1998. It is elegant. It is geologically dramatic. It provides a specific, datable cause for what the genetic evidence shows. And it is contested, not the existence of the bottleneck. The genetic evidence for a severe reduction in human population size is robust, widely replicated, and not seriously disputed. What is contested is whether Toba specifically caused it, and whether the two events were even simultaneous. The challenges began emerging in the 2000s and 2010s as archaeologists conducted more precise excavations at sites near the Toba ash layer. The Toba eruption, uniquely among volcanic events, left behind a chemically distinctive ash layer, called the youngest Toba tuff, that can be identified in geological deposits across a vast area from Africa through the Middle East to India, Malaysia, and beyond. Wherever this ash layer is present, it acts as a precise time marker. Anything below it predates the eruption. Anything above it post-dates it. Archaeologists expected to find a stark discontinuity at the ash layer, human artifacts below, a gap, then resumption of activity much later as survivors slowly recovered. What several excavations found was considerably more ambiguous. At the Jwalapuram site in southern India, researchers found stone tools both below and above the Toba ash layer, without any obvious change in the technology or density of human occupation. The same tool-making tradition appeared to continue through and after the eruption, suggesting that in some locations, human populations may not have been completely wiped out by the event. In South Africa, archaeological sites show continued human occupation through the Toba period, with no obvious interruption. Several well-preserved middens, ancient rubbish heaps containing shells, animal bones, and tools show continuous use through the relevant time period. These findings do not disprove the Toba hypothesis. They complicate it. There are several possible interpretations. One is that the Toba eruption was less globally devastating than originally modeled, that some regions, particularly coastal environments and southern latitudes, were partially buffered from the worst effects. Another is that the human population bottleneck predates the Toba eruption, that it occurred earlier, perhaps during a climate oscillation, and that Toba was a contributing factor to an already stressed and reduced population, rather than the primary cause. A third possibility, which has gained traction in the last decade, is that the bottleneck was not a single event at all, that the genetic signature we see is not the fingerprint of one catastrophe, but the accumulated compression of a species that spent much of its early history living on the margins. Small, scattered, frequently reduced by regional droughts, glaciations, and other environmental pressures, and that never maintained the large, stable, widely distributed population that would have allowed robust genetic diversity to accumulate. The human genome contains evidence for multiple episodes of reduced population size. The PSMC analysis, which I mentioned earlier, doesn't show a single sharp crash. It shows a more complex history, a large ancestral population of perhaps 10,000 effective individuals in Africa before 200,000 years ago, then a gradual decline through the Middle Stone Age, reaching its minimum sometime between 70,000 and 100,000 years ago. This gradual decline is more consistent with a prolonged period of environmental stress than with a single catastrophic event. What the Toba eruption may have done in this revised picture is not cause the bottleneck by itself, but deliver a final, near-lethal blow to a population that was already small, fragmented, and under stress. The killing stroke rather than the cause of death. And that is, in some ways, an even more disturbing picture, because it suggests that for much of our species' early history, for the first 100,000 to 150,000 years of Homo sapiens as a distinct species, we were a marginal, fragile, frequently near-extinct form of life. Not the dominant megafauna, not the apex predator. Just another small-brained, well, relatively small-brained, African primate scratching out a living on the edges of a continent, routinely battered by droughts and cold snaps and volcanic winters, never quite establishing the foothold that would have made our survival secure. This revised picture has an important implication for how we think about human exceptionalism. We tend to regard our current global dominance as evidence that we were always, in some sense, destined to succeed, that our intelligence and creativity and adaptability were so superior to those of our contemporaries that our rise to planetary dominance was inevitable. The genetic evidence does not support this narrative. The genetic evidence suggests we were, for most of our existence, clinging on. Surviving not because of overwhelming superiority, but because of marginal sufficiency. Good enough, just barely enough. The anthropologist Richard Wrangham has argued that the control of fire, cooking, was the key technological innovation that set Homo sapiens on a different trajectory from all other primates. Cooking makes food safer, more digestible, and more calorie-dense. It dramatically expands the range of edible foods available, and it frees time that would otherwise be spent chewing. The cognitive consequences of the dietary upgrade that cooking provides may have been central to the encephalization, brain enlargement of the Homo lineage. Without fire and cooking, we might have remained a different kind of creature entirely. But fire and the cognitive advantages it provides was not sufficient to prevent near extinction. Intelligence did not save us. Adaptability did not save us. What saved us was a coastline in the right place, a marine food chain that kept working when everything else failed, and the extraordinary accident of a small group of people being in the right geographic location when the world ended. The story of human prehistory is often told as a march of progress, from primitive to modern, from weak to strong, from ignorant to knowing. The genetic evidence tells a different story. It tells a story of a species that spent most of its existence teetering on the edge of the abyss, making it through by luck and resourcefulness in roughly equal measure. Chapter 5. The Archaeology of Near Extinction. What the silence tells us. One of the most powerful and most overlooked kinds of archaeological evidence is the absence of evidence. This requires a moment of explanation, because absence of evidence is not evidence of absence is a principle that gets misapplied constantly, including in discussions of human prehistory. What I mean is not that we should read specific meaning into any particular gap. I mean that when you take a broad enough view, when you look at the global archaeological record across the full time span in question, the silence that descends on human sites around 70,000 to 90,000 years ago is too consistent and too widespread to be explained by sampling bias or preservation issues alone. Before the bottleneck period, say 150,000 to 120,000 years ago, the archaeological record of Africa shows evidence of a species that was doing reasonably well. There are sites scattered across East Africa, North Africa, and Southern Africa. There is evidence of Middle Stone Age technology, prepared core techniques for making stone tools, the use of ochre for apparent symbolic purposes, the exploitation of a wide variety of food resources. There is even evidence of long-distance exchange of materials, silkcrete and other stones transported tens to hundreds of kilometers from their sources, suggesting that different human groups were in contact and trading with one another. Then the record thins. Sites become fewer. The geographic distribution contracts. The evidence of long-distance exchange diminishes. The diversity of tool forms narrows. By around 90,000 to 80,000 years ago, the archaeological signature of Homo sapiens in Africa has pulled back dramatically from its earlier extent. This is what population collapse looks like from the outside, viewed through the imperfect lens of stone tools, and food remains preserved in ancient sediments. But what makes this period particularly revealing is not just the contraction of the record. It's the geography of what survives. Archaeologists have identified a pattern of what they call refugia, pockets of landscape where conditions remained hospitable through the worst of the bottleneck period, and where the archaeological record shows continuous human occupation when surrounding regions went dark. Several of these refugia are clustered along the coastline of southern Africa, particularly around the Cape region and along what is now the South African coast. These coastal sites, Pinnacle Point, Blombos Cave, Saibudu Cave, and several others, preserve a remarkable record of human ingenuity under pressure. The people who lived in these places were not primitive. They were fishing. They were harvesting shellfish in enormous quantities. The ancient middens at Pinnacle Point contain millions of shell fragments, evidence of systematic, organized exploitation of the intertidal zone. They were making tools from heated silkcrete, a heat treatment process that makes the stone easier to work and was once thought to have been invented much later. They were using red ochre for purposes that go beyond simple practicality. They were, by any reasonable measure, behaviorally modern human beings. And they were living in tiny, isolated groups on the edge of a continent whose interior had largely emptied of human presence. Blombos Cave, situated on a dramatic coastal cliff in the western Cape of South Africa, is one of the most important archaeological sites in the world for this period. It has been excavated with extraordinary care over several decades, and what it has produced is a portrait of human sophistication that rewrites the story of cognitive modernity. Engraved ochre pieces bearing geometric patterns, ochre processing toolkits, shell beads that may have been worn as personal ornaments, evidence of systematic seafood exploitation including fish, shellfish, and marine mammals. These people were making art. They were making jewelry. They were manipulating symbols. They were, in the ways that matter most to us, recognizably human, but they were desperately few. The cave itself shows evidence of repeated episodic occupation. The site was occupied, abandoned, reoccupied, suggesting a very small local group that used the cave as one of several seasonal locations. Population estimates for the human community that used Blombos Cave and its contemporary sites range from a few hundred to perhaps a few thousand individuals in the entire southern African coastal refugium. Think about what that actually meant in daily life. These were people who likely knew every other person in their social world personally. The universe of human faces, voices, and names was small enough to fit around a fire. There was no elsewhere to go, no larger population to rejoin, no other group to seek refuge with when food ran short or disaster struck. The extinction of a single family group through disease or accident might represent a loss of 1% of all the humans alive. And yet, here is the thing that gets me every time. They were making jewelry, under existential pressure so severe that the entire future of the human species balanced on whether they could find enough shellfish and whether this winter was cold enough to end them. They were doing something that served no immediate survival purpose. They were decorating themselves. They were making marks on ochre that meant something to them, that communicated something to the people around them. That impulse, the impulse to make meaning even under the worst possible conditions, is the thing that survived the bottleneck. It is encoded in us as deeply as any biological trait. It is, in some sense, what we are. Chapter 6. Genetic Ghosts. The people who didn't make it to now. I want to talk about something that doesn't get nearly enough attention in popular treatments of this subject. It's one of the most haunting findings to emerge from the genomics revolution, and it reframes the story of human near extinction in a profound way. When we talk about the population bottleneck and the near extinction of our species, we tend to frame it as a story about Homo sapiens, about our lineage, about the direct ancestors of the 8 billion people alive today. But we were not alone in the world. The period of human history we're discussing, 70,000 to 100,000 years ago, was not populated only by anatomically modern Homo sapiens. The world at that time contained multiple human species, or at minimum, multiple highly distinct human populations, each with their own history, their own distribution, their own relationship to the catastrophes of that era. There were the Neanderthals. Homo neanderthalensis had been in Europe and Western Asia for at least 300,000 years before modern humans arrived. They were not the dim-witted brutes of early popular imagination. Modern research has established that they used pigments for body decoration, made jewelry from eagle talons, constructed complex structures, deliberately buried their dead, and possibly sang or used proto-language. They were cognitively sophisticated beings who had survived multiple ice ages and built a durable cultural tradition across a vast geographic range. There were the Denisovans, a group so recently discovered that they don't even have a formal species name. We know they existed almost entirely from a handful of teeth and bone fragments found in Denisova Cave in Siberia and from DNA sequences. The Denisovans were genetically distinct from both modern humans and Neanderthals, shared a common ancestor with Neanderthals about 400,000 years ago, and occupied a geographic range that extended from Siberia to Southeast Asia and possibly beyond. There were the hobbits, Homo floresiensis, tiny, small-brained hominins who survived on the Indonesian island of Flores until at least 50,000 years ago and possibly more recently. Their evolutionary origin is still debated. Some researchers believe they were derived from Homo erectus, others from an even earlier hominin. But their existence until the very recent past, when modern humans were already spreading through Southeast Asia, is uncontested. There may have been others. The genetic evidence increasingly suggests that the picture of human diversity in this period was more complex than we imagined even a decade ago. Ancient DNA analysis of fossils from China and other parts of Asia has hinted at additional distinct populations that don't fit neatly into any of the known categories. All of these human relatives are now gone. The Neanderthals disappeared around 40,000 years ago, shortly after modern humans arrived in Europe. The Denisovans disappeared around the same time, or perhaps somewhat later in Southeast Asia. Homo floresiensis was gone by 50,000 years ago. Whatever other groups may have existed left no surviving lineages. They are extinct. Every last one of them. A moment in evolutionary history when the world contained multiple distinct types of human being has given way to a world with exactly one: us. And here is the finding that makes this story so strange and so intimate. They are not entirely gone. The first complete sequencing of the Neanderthal genome, published by Svante Pääbo and his team at the Max Planck Institute in 2010, revealed something that shocked the field. Modern humans outside of sub-Saharan Africa carry on average about 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA. People from East Asia tend to carry slightly more than people from Europe. People from Oceania, particularly those with Melanesian ancestry, carry additional Denisovan DNA, typically 4 to 6%, on top of their Neanderthal contribution. There was interbreeding. When modern humans migrated out of Africa and encountered Neanderthals and Denisovans, they did not simply replace them. They absorbed them. Partially, incompletely, but measurably, irreversibly, the people who didn't make it as distinct lineages are still here, in fragments, distributed across the genomes of the people who did. And it turns out that some of that inherited DNA matters. Specific Neanderthal genetic variants carried by modern humans have been associated with differences in immune function. Some protective, some potentially making us more susceptible to certain diseases. Denisovan-derived genetic variants in Tibetan and other Himalayan populations include variants of a gene called EPAS1 that are critical for adapting to low oxygen conditions at high altitude. Without that Denisovan inheritance, the history of human settlement at altitude would have been different. The people who went extinct gave us tools. Not metaphorical tools, actual genetic adaptations, refined over hundreds of thousands of years of evolutionary pressure in specific environments that we incorporated into our own genome through interbreeding and that we still carry today. The list of Neanderthal-derived genetic variants that appear to have functional consequences in modern humans is growing every year. Some variants are associated with faster blood clotting, useful for wound healing, though in modern populations with very different lifestyles, the same variants are associated with increased risk of thrombosis. Some are associated with aspects of the immune response, including innate immune pathways that may have been refined by hundreds of thousands of years of Neanderthal coevolution with the pathogens of Europe and Western Asia. When modern humans first arrived in Europe, encountering microbes their African immune systems had never encountered, the Neanderthal immune variants in their hybrid descendants may have been the difference between surviving and succumbing. The Denisovan contribution to Tibetan populations tells a particularly striking story. The Denisovan-derived EPAS1 variant, which enables Tibetans to function in the low oxygen environments above 4,000 meters, does not appear in any other major human population. It does appear in Denisovan genomes. The most plausible interpretation is that Denisovans, who occupied a range extending from Siberia through Central Asia and possibly into Southeast Asia, lived at altitude long enough to evolve adaptations to hypoxia. When a small number of modern humans encountered and interbred with Denisovans at high altitude sometime before 40,000 years ago, their descendants inherited this adaptation. Those descendants could thrive on the Tibetan plateau. Their non-Denisovan contemporaries largely could not. An entire civilization, the Tibetan culture, with its thousands of years of history, its art and religion and philosophy, its extraordinary adaptation to one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth, exists in part because of a genetic contribution from a people who are otherwise completely gone. This is one of the most extraordinary findings in all of modern science, and I don't think it's gotten the philosophical attention it deserves. The Denisovans are extinct. There are no living Denisovans. There never will be again. But something of the Denisovans lives in the Tibetan people, who can thrive at altitudes that would kill the rest of us, and in the Melanesian islanders, who carry their DNA at measurable levels. The Neanderthals are extinct. but something of them persists in the immune systems and physiology of every non-African human alive. Extinction is not always clean. It is not always total. And the boundary between a population that survived and one that went extinct is blurrier, in genomic terms, than our intuitions about discrete species would suggest. We are not entirely Homo sapiens. We are Homo sapiens plus fragments of the ones who didn't make it. We carry the genetic ghosts of the extinct. And those ghosts, it turns out, are doing useful work. Chapter 7, The Bottleneck Inside Your Head. Here's a question I want you to sit with for a moment before we move on. If every human being alive today is descended from a tiny group of survivors, a population small enough to fit in a large office building, what did that do to us? Not just genetically, psychologically, behaviorally, to the architecture of the mind that we carry around and mistake daily for a neutral instrument of perception and reason. Because here is the thing about evolution that people tend to forget when they're thinking about deep time. It operates through survival and reproduction, and the conditions that determine survival and reproduction leave their mark. The brain is not a general-purpose reasoning machine that was designed from scratch by an intelligent engineer. It is a cobbled-together product of millions of years of incremental modification under specific environmental pressures. And the pressures that shaped it most recently and most intensely were precisely the pressures of the bottleneck era, the conditions under which our ancestors survived when most of theirs didn't. What were those conditions? Small groups, extreme resource scarcity, high unpredictability, constant low-level threat from the environment and from other groups, radical dependence on the cooperation of a small number of known, trusted individuals, radical vulnerability to anyone outside that group. And that is the world the human brain was shaped to navigate. Not the world of cities and institutions and global supply chains and anonymous strangers who mostly mean you no harm. The world of a few dozen people, a hostile landscape, dwindling food, and the knowledge, deep, wordless, bone-level knowledge, that if your group breaks apart, you die. The evolutionary psychologists John Tooby and Leda Cosmids spent decades arguing that the human mind is best understood as a collection of specialized cognitive mechanisms, each shaped by selection to solve specific adaptive problems faced by our ancestors. And the adaptive problems faced by humans during the bottleneck period, by the people living in those tiny coastal refugia, the people who made it through, were overwhelmingly social problems. Who can I trust? Who is with us and who is against us? Who is competing with me for scarce resources? How do I maintain my position within the group hierarchy? These problems generated cognitive mechanisms that are still running in your head right now, whether you want them to or not. The in-group/out-group distinction, the deep automatic tendency to categorize people as us or them, and to respond to each category differently, is one of the most robustly documented findings in social psychology. It operates faster than conscious thought. It operates on minimal cues, a different language, a different style of dress, a different color of jersey at a sporting event. In one famous series of experiments by Henri Tajfel in the 1970s, researchers assigned people to arbitrary groups based on nothing more than whether they preferred paintings by Klee or Kandinsky, a distinction that should mean nothing. and immediately those people began preferring and favoring their own group. The in-group/out-group machinery was running on completely meaningless input, generating real discriminatory behavior. This is the psychology of the bottleneck. It was adaptive when the group was a few dozen people, and any stranger was a potential competitor for survival-critical resources. It is maladaptive in a globalized world of 8 billion people, where the boundaries of us and them are arbitrary, and the costs of out-group hostility cascade at civilizational scale. But it runs anyway, because evolution doesn't optimize for the world we're in. It optimizes for the world we were in. The psychologist Paul Bloom has written extensively about how the bottleneck psychology interacts with our capacity for violence. Humans are capable of extraordinary kindness and cooperation, but almost always toward people we have categorized as in-group members. Toward out-group members, the same cognitive system that generates warm generosity generates cold indifference or outright hostility. The history of human violence, wars, genocides, ethnic cleansing, the casual cruelty of groups toward those they define as other, is in significant part the history of an in-group/out-group processing system that was calibrated for survival in small groups, running as threat detection software in a world it was never designed for. There's more. The bottleneck era was not just socially fraught. It was environmentally unpredictable in ways that left another cognitive mark: anxiety. The human capacity for anticipatory fear, for worrying about things that haven't happened yet, is, by some measures, the defining feature of human cognition. No other species spends as much mental energy as we do imagining future negative scenarios. Evolution produced this capacity because it was useful. In an environment where a drought could kill you, or a predator could take you, or a rival group could raid your camp. The ability to mentally simulate future threats and prepare for them gave you a survival edge. The person who worried about tomorrow had more children than the person who didn't. And so the genome of the survivors is saturated with the genetic basis for worry. The result is a species that, even in conditions of objective safety and abundance, generates anxiety about the future at a rate that our circumstances rarely justify. Modern anxiety disorders, which affect roughly 1 in 7 people globally and represent some of the most common and debilitating mental health conditions on Earth, are, in this framework, an evolutionary overshoot. The system was calibrated for a world of scarcity and threat. In a world of relative safety, it runs at settings that exceed what the environment demands. There's also a phenomenon that psychologists call loss aversion. The well-documented finding that humans feel the pain of losing something about twice as intensely as the pleasure of gaining something of equivalent value. In the bottleneck environment, loss aversion was essential. Losing food, losing shelter, losing a group member. In that context, losses were potentially lethal in a way that equivalent gains were not. The asymmetric weighting was adaptive. Today, it makes us irrationally reluctant to accept necessary losses in negotiations, in policy, in personal decisions, even when the rational analysis is clear. It distorts our relationship with risk in ways that matter at every scale of human organization. We are, psychologically, still living in the bottleneck. The haunted quality of human consciousness, the background hum of threat and scarcity and tribal loyalty that underlies even our most sophisticated and civilized behavior, is the legacy of the survivors. We inherited their genes, their instincts, their threat detection systems, their social paranoia. We are, in a very real sense, built from the psychology of people who made it through the worst thing that has ever happened to our species. And that psychology saved us. It is also, in the 21st century, one of the most dangerous things about us. Chapter 8. The Explosion. From the edge of nothing to everywhere. Let's talk about what happened after, because the story of the bottleneck doesn't end with survival. It ends, eventually, after what must have been thousands of years of continued precarity, with something that is, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary events in the history of life on Earth. The survivors expanded, slowly at first. The genetic evidence suggests the population began to grow again sometime after 70,000 years ago, but growth was probably tentative and intermittent for tens of thousands of years. There is no evidence of a sudden demographic explosion immediately following the bottleneck. Recovery from a bottleneck of this severity takes time. The ecological damage wrought by a volcanic supereruption doesn't heal overnight, and a population of a few thousand people in isolated refugia takes a long time to build the numbers and the territorial range required for robust survival. But by around 60,000 to 70,000 years ago, something had changed. The DNA evidence shows the beginning of a sustained expansion in human effective population size. The archaeological record, which had been almost silent across much of Africa and Asia for tens of thousands of years, begins to fill in again. And then, beginning around 60,000 years ago, modern humans began to do something that no hominin had done before at anything like this scale or speed. They went everywhere. The out of Africa expansion, the migration of a small founding population of modern humans out of the African continent and into the wider world, is one of the most studied events in the history of our species. The genetic evidence for it is unambiguous. Comparing the DNA of people from different parts of the world reveals a pattern of decreasing genetic diversity as you move away from Africa. People in sub-Saharan Africa show the most genetic diversity. People in East Asia show less. People in the Americas show the least of all. This is exactly what you would predict if a small founding group left Africa with a subset of its genetic diversity, and that subset was further reduced as successive founding groups branched off to populate new regions. The mitochondrial haplogroup L3, one of the most ancient African mitochondrial lineages, is the ancestor of all non-African mitochondrial lineages. All the people outside Africa trace their maternal ancestry to a single population within the L3 haplogroup, suggesting that the out of Africa founding event was accomplished by a group that was itself small, perhaps a few hundred to a few thousand individuals, carrying only a fraction of the genetic diversity present in Africa at the time. This was not a migration in the sense of a large organized movement of people. It was more like a slow seeping of small groups across gradually expanding ranges. People don't typically pack up and move 1,000 miles to somewhere entirely new. They move to the next valley over, and their descendants move to the next valley after that. And over thousands of generations, the range expands. a migration of 20,000 kilometers from Africa to Australia, which modern humans reached by about 50,000 years ago, requiring the crossing of multiple open water straits, might represent hundreds of generations of incremental range expansion, each step no larger than a day's walk from known territory. What is striking is the speed. In geological terms, the expansion of modern humans from Africa to Australia, Siberia, Europe, and eventually the Americas happened almost instantaneously. Within 30,000 to 40,000 years of the beginning of the out-of-Africa migration, Homo sapiens had colonized every habitable landmass except Antarctica and the Pacific Islands. No other species in the history of terrestrial life has achieved anything like this geographic range in anything like this time frame. What drove it? Why did humans expand so rapidly when they had spent the previous 100,000 years clinging to a few coastal refugia? Part of the answer is probably climate. The period from roughly 60,000 to 50,000 years ago saw a complex of climate shifts that opened corridors through previously impassable environments. Corridors across the Sahara when it was briefly greener, across southern Asia, eventually across the land bridge from Siberia to Alaska. Climate windows opened that had been closed for tens of thousands of years, and humans moved through them. Part of the answer is demographic. The population, after millennia of slow recovery, had reached a size at which it could sustain the adventurous minority. The people at the edges who kept moving, who pushed into new territory, who found that over the hill there was another valley and another animal that hadn't yet learned to be afraid of humans. And part of the answer may be technological. The archaeological record of the period leading up to and following the out-of-Africa expansion shows what appear to be genuine innovations in tool-making, hunting technique, and resource exploitation. Composite tools, weapons made from multiple components, like a stone point hafted onto a wooden shaft, appear during this period, making hunting both safer and more effective. Evidence of long-range projectile weapons, possibly including early forms of bow and arrow or spear thrower, changes the calculus of the hunter. You can kill large animals from a distance that leaves you outside their reach. The large, naive megafauna of Australia and the Americas had never encountered this kind of hunting, and their population dynamics had never been shaped by selection pressure from an efficient human hunter. They were, quite literally, sitting targets. Part of the answer may be cognitive. There is a hypothesis, sometimes called the behavioral modernity hypothesis, though it is debated, that something changed in human cognition shortly before or during the out-of-Africa expansion. The archaeological record shows a step change in the complexity of human cultural production around 50,000 to 70,000 years ago. More elaborate art, more sophisticated tools, more evidence of symbolic thought, more long-distance trade networks. Some researchers have proposed that this reflects a genetic change, possibly in the neural architecture supporting language or abstract thought, that gave the founding population of modern humans a cognitive edge that their predecessors lacked. Others argue that this pattern is an artifact of sampling, that behavioral modernity emerged gradually, and the evidence from Africa before the out-of-Africa migration, including the Blombos cave material, shows that at least some humans were already behaviorally modern well before the expansion. The debate continues. What is not in dispute is the outcome. The survivors of the bottleneck and their descendants spread across the planet with a speed and thoroughness that suggests something qualitatively different from what had come before. Whether it was genetics, climate, demography, or some combination, the near extinct became, within a geological eye blink, ubiquitous. Chapter 9: Survivors and Destroyers. What we did after we made it here is where the story of near extinction develops an uncomfortable sequel. The people who survived the bottleneck and their descendants who spread across the world carried with them a cognitive legacy shaped by scarcity and threat. And as they moved into new environments that had never seen a human being, filled with animals that had never learned to be afraid of anything walking on two legs, they brought that legacy with them. The megafauna extinctions of the late Pleistocene are one of the most consequential and most debated events in the history of life on Earth in the last 50,000 years. On every continent that modern humans colonized for the first time, a wave of large animal extinctions followed within a few thousand years of human arrival. The pattern is too consistent and too geographically correlated with human expansion to be coincidental, and most researchers now believe that humans were the primary cause, though the details remain debated. In Australia, within roughly 2,000 to 5,000 years of human arrival around 50,000 years ago, approximately 85% of the continent's large mammals went extinct. Diprotodon, a wombat-like marsupial the size of a rhinoceros. The giant, short-faced kangaroo, Procoptodon. Palurkestes, a bizarre tapir-like marsupial with a prehensile trunk. Thylacoleo, the marsupial lion. Giant lizards. Giant birds. Gone, all of them, within a geological instant of the first human footprint on the continent. In the Americas, the extinctions were equally dramatic. Mammoths, mastodons, ground sloths the size of elephants, glyptodons, armadillos the size of small cars, American horses, camels, lions, and cheetahs. All of them survived the ice ages that preceded human arrival. None of them survived the arrival of humans. Within a few thousand years of the first Paleo-Indians crossing into the Americas from Siberia, the continent's megafauna had been almost entirely eliminated. In Europe and Asia, the pattern is more complex. Humans and megafauna had coexisted for tens of thousands of years, which presumably allowed the animals to develop some wariness of human hunters. But even there, the final extinctions of woolly mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, and cave bears correlate with the spread of anatomically modern humans and the intensification of human hunting pressure. The mechanism is debated. Were humans directly hunting these animals to extinction? Was habitat change the primary driver? Was climate stress, the transition out of the last ice age, the main cause, with human pressure as an additional factor? The honest answer is that it was probably all three, in different proportions in different places, with humans providing the final push to populations already under environmental stress. What is disturbing about this pattern is that it tells us something about the people who survived the bottleneck, the people who escaped near extinction and then repopulated the world. They did not emerge from their near-death experience chastened, humble, careful with the living world. They did not develop a culture of ecological restraint in proportion to their own recent fragility. They expanded, as we have seen, rapidly and thoroughly. And as they expanded, they reshaped the ecosystems they entered in ways that were profound and permanent. The megafauna extinctions were not a product of malice. The Paleo-Indians who hunted the last mammoths were not evil people. They were doing what the human brain in scarcity conditions is wired to do: exploit available resources as thoroughly as possible, because in the world the bottleneck survivors came from, the resource that was abundant today might be gone tomorrow. The cognitive system calibrated for scarcity does not automatically apply the brakes when abundance is available. It exploits. There is a concept in ecology called the shifting baseline syndrome, coined by fisheries scientist Daniel Pauly. The idea is that each generation perceives the state of the environment as it appeared during their childhood as normal, even if that baseline was already severely degraded from a previous generation's perspective. This produces a ratchet effect of perception. Fishermen in the 1990s thought the depleted fishing grounds they were working were normal because that's what they grew up with, even though those grounds had supported 10 times as many fish in the 1950s, which fishermen of that era would have found depleted compared to the 1900s, and so on backward through time. The megafauna extinctions are the deep prehistorical version of this syndrome. We have no memory of a North America with mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, and native horses. Those animals are not part of our baseline, but they were part of the world for millions of years before humans arrived, and their loss fundamentally changed the ecology of the continents they inhabited. The American Southwest without mammoths, the Australian plains without diprotodons, the Eurasian steppe without woolly rhinoceroses. These are not pristine natural environments. They are the aftermath of the most recent major extinction event, one that our ancestors caused. This is the other face of the bottleneck legacy. The same psychology that drove survival, the urgent, anxious, resource-seeking, risk-taking, expansive psychology of people who had recently been nearly nothing, was also the psychology of ecological devastation. The survivors became, within a few tens of thousands of years, the most destructive ecological force the planet had seen since the asteroid that ended the Cretaceous. We tend to tell two separate stories about human prehistory. Story 1. The plucky survivors, the coastal refugia, the ochre-painted cave walls, the shellfish and the jewelry and the humanity in extremis. Story 2. The megafauna killers, the rapid global spread, the ecological dominion established through relentless exploitation. These are the same story. They are the same people, driven by the same psychology, shaped by the same catastrophe. The warmth and the destruction are both legacies of the bottleneck. We were shaped in the crucible of near extinction into a form of life that is extraordinarily capable of surviving, and extraordinarily capable of making it harder for other things to survive alongside us. Chapter 10. The signature in our cells. What the bottleneck left behind. We have been talking about the bottleneck as a historical event, but it is more than that. It is present in every living human being, encoded in our biology in ways that go beyond the reduced genetic diversity we've already discussed. The bottleneck left specific molecular signatures that researchers are still cataloging and interpreting. One of the most striking is in our immune system. The human immune system contains a set of molecules called human leukocyte antigens, or HLA, proteins encoded by the most variable genes in the human genome. HLA molecules are responsible for presenting fragments of pathogens to immune cells, triggering an immune response. The diversity of HLA variants in a population is a direct measure of how broadly that population can respond to novel pathogens. More diverse HLA means the immune system is better equipped to recognize and fight a wider variety of infections. Modern human HLA diversity is significantly lower than what we would expect for a species of our age and ecological range. It is consistent with having passed through a severe population bottleneck. And the specific HLA variants we carry, the ones that survived, are biased toward variants that were presumably common in or particularly relevant to the population that made it through the bottleneck. This has consequences. There are pathogens to which modern humans are more vulnerable than they would be if we had maintained our ancestral genetic diversity. There are immune responses that are suboptimal because the variants that would have handled certain threats better were lost when the population crashed. The COVID-19 pandemic provided a striking modern illustration of this principle. Individuals with certain HLA variants showed dramatically different outcomes from infection than individuals with other variants. Some variants associated with severe disease, others with mild or asymptomatic infection. The distribution of these variants across human populations is not random. It reflects the specific history of pathogen exposure in different regions, including the specific bottleneck events that pruned different populations' HLA diversity at different points in history. There is also the question of founder effects in specific human populations. The Out of Africa founding event was itself a bottleneck. A small group carrying a subset of African genetic diversity founded the non-African world. But subsequent founding events further compressed diversity. The founding of the Americas represents a particularly striking case. The Paleo-Indian founders who crossed from Siberia into Alaska at the end of the last ice age apparently did so in one or a very small number of crossing events, by a genetically restricted founding population. The result is that Native American populations show even lower genetic diversity than other non-African populations, and carry specific founder effects. Elevated frequencies of certain genetic variants that were common in the founding group that are not seen in other populations. Some of these founder effects have medical consequences that persist to the present day. Certain genetic diseases are elevated in frequency in specific populations because they were present in founders at high frequency. Type 2 diabetes rates in some indigenous American populations are among the highest in the world, a situation that may be related in part to a founder effect combined with a metabolic adaptation to the highly variable food supply of the Paleo-Indian world that became maladaptive when caloric abundance replaced periodic starvation. The thrifty genotype hypothesis, proposed by geneticist James Neal in 1962 and since refined and debated extensively, suggests that genes promoting efficient fat storage were adaptive in feast or famine environments and became risk factors for metabolic disease in environments of chronic caloric surplus. Whatever its precise mechanism, the connection between a population's founding history and its current disease patterns is one of the most direct and medically relevant legacies of the bottleneck. The Ashkenazi Jewish population presents another well-studied case. Having gone through a severe founding bottleneck approximately 700 to 1,000 years ago, Ashkenazi Jews show elevated rates of several genetic diseases. Tay-Sachs, Gaucher's disease, BRCA cancer mutations that appear to have been common in the founding population. They also, intriguingly, show elevated average scores on certain cognitive tests in some studies, which some researchers have linked to selection for specific cognitive traits during the historical period when Ashkenazi Jews were largely restricted to cognitively demanding occupations. The genetics of intelligence and the genetics of disease risk are not usually on the same page, and the Ashkenazi case has been debated vigorously. But as an illustration of how founder effects ripple forward through time in biologically consequential ways, it is striking. But the bottleneck signature goes beyond genetics. There is increasing evidence that epigenetic, above the genome, changes that occurred during periods of severe stress were transmitted across generations. Epigenetic modifications are chemical changes to the packaging of DNA that affect which genes are expressed without changing the DNA sequence itself. They can be influenced by environmental stressors, starvation, trauma, extreme cold. And there is evidence from both animal studies and human historical data that some epigenetic changes induced by severe stress can be inherited by the next generation and possibly several generations beyond. The descendants of people who survived famine, for example, show specific epigenetic patterns in genes related to metabolism that differ from populations that did not experience comparable food stress. The children of Holocaust survivors show altered stress hormone regulation compared to controls in ways that appear to have epigenetic basis. These studies are controversial, and the field of transgenerational epigenetics in humans is still young and contested. But if the principle holds, if some of what our ancestors experienced during the bottleneck is encoded not just in our DNA sequence, but in its epigenetic regulation, then the terror and starvation and loss of the bottleneck era may be present in our cells in ways we are only beginning to understand. We are not merely descended from the survivors. In a biological sense, that is more literal than metaphor. We may still be carrying their experience. Chapter 11. Could it happen again? Everything we have discussed so far is past tense. The near extinction, the bottleneck, the loss of genetic diversity, the coastal refugia, the achingly small population that made it through. All of this happened. It is finished. We survived. But the question the past forces on the present is not just, how did we almost go extinct? It is, could we go extinct? Not almost. Actually, and here the science, combined with the historical perspective we have been building, produces an answer that is more sobering than most people want to hear. Yes, absolutely yes. There is nothing special about Homo sapiens that makes us extinction-proof. The fossil record is a graveyard of species that were, in their time, the dominant life forms of their environments, species that thrived for millions of years, that survived multiple climate shifts and ecological upheavals, that seemed, if any species ever could, like permanent fixtures of the living world. And they are gone. The average duration of a mammalian species in the fossil record is about 1 to 2 million years. Homo sapiens, as a distinct species, is roughly 300,000 years old. We are, by the standards of mammalian evolutionary time, in our infancy. There's nothing in the fossil record to suggest that we should expect to persist longer than any other mammal, and there is quite a lot in our current situation to suggest that the threats we face are of a kind and a scale that previous generations of our species never had to contend with. Let me be specific about what those threats are, because this is not a generalized claim about vague existential risk. It is a claim about specific, well-characterized mechanisms. Nuclear war. The combined nuclear arsenal of humanity currently contains roughly 12,000 warheads. A large-scale nuclear exchange between major powers would not simply destroy the targeted cities. It would inject enormous quantities of soot and aerosols into the stratosphere, causing a nuclear winter that some models predict could reduce global agricultural production by 90% or more for several years. A nuclear winter of sufficient severity would cause famine on a global scale, potentially killing billions. In the worst-case scenarios modeled by researchers like Brian Toon at the University of Colorado, a nuclear winter from a large-scale exchange could reduce the global population to a level comparable to the bottleneck. A few million survivors scattered across the most productive agricultural regions, struggling to maintain the technological and social infrastructure required for long-term survival. The parallel to the Toba scenario is not incidental. Toba injected enormous quantities of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere. Nuclear weapons would inject enormous quantities of soot and carbon aerosols. Both produce a volcanic or nuclear winter by the same mechanism. A reflective layer in the upper atmosphere that blocks incoming sunlight, rapidly cooling the surface and disrupting photosynthesis on a global scale. The difference is that Toba was natural and unintended, while a nuclear winter would be the consequence of decisions made by human beings. Decisions shaped, at least in part, by the same tribal in-group/out-group psychology that the bottleneck bequeathed us. We have constructed, with our own hands, a mechanism for replicating the worst event in our species' history. On purpose, deliberately aimed at other human beings, that should horrify us more than it does. And I think the reason it doesn't horrify us more is precisely the cognitive numbness that the bottleneck psychology produces. The threats are abstract, distant, statistical. The tribal loyalties that drive the arms race are immediate, visceral, real in the way that abstract existential risk is not. Our brains were not built to feel appropriately about risks that are geographically and temporally distant, even when those risks are statistically massive. That is the bottleneck psychology, operating exactly as it was designed to operate, and producing, in the nuclear age, an output that is potentially fatal for the species. Pandemic. The COVID-19 pandemic killed millions and disrupted global society in ways that are still unfolding. But COVID-19, terrible as it was not a civilization-ending event. The pathogens that concern biosecurity researchers most are those that combine high lethality with high transmissibility, a combination that COVID-19 fortunately did not fully achieve. The 1918 influenza pandemic, which killed an estimated 50 to 100 million people at a time when the global population was about 2 billion, is a demonstration that naturally occurring pathogens can achieve near civilizational impact. Bioengineered pathogens, the deliberate creation of more lethal or transmissible versions of existing diseases, represent a risk category that did not exist 30 years ago and is growing more accessible as biotechnology advances. Climate change. The human-caused increase in atmospheric greenhouse gases is currently on track to produce a global temperature increase of 2 to 4 degrees Celsius by the end of this century, with further warming locked in for centuries beyond. This will not directly cause human extinction in the near term. Humans can survive in a wide range of climates, and even a 4-degree warmer world would be habitable in many regions. But the indirect effects, disruption of agricultural systems, displacement of hundreds of millions of people, intensification of extreme weather events, destabilization of the ecosystems that provide the food, water, and climate regulation that civilization depends on, could produce social, political, and demographic shocks that cascade in unpredictable ways. There is a particular feedback mechanism worth naming explicitly. Climate change threatens agricultural productivity in precisely the regions: Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, that have the highest population densities and the lowest adaptive capacity. A simultaneous multi-breadbasket failure, the collapse of crop yields in multiple major agricultural regions in the same year due to drought or heat stress, is a scenario that agricultural economists study with considerable anxiety. The Al-Tube-Satya global food system has very little buffer. We produce roughly what we consume each year. Global grain reserves are typically measured in weeks of supply, not years. A major agricultural shock could produce famine at a scale not seen in modern history, with cascading social and political consequences that would destabilize governments and potentially trigger the conflicts that escalate into the nuclear scenarios. These risks are interconnected. That is what makes them genuinely frightening in a way that single, isolated threats are not. A pandemic weakens institutions that would otherwise manage climate risks. Climate displacement creates refugee pressures that escalate political tensions that increase nuclear risks. Each thread pulls on the others. Artificial intelligence? I include this not because I want to participate in breathless speculation about superintelligent AI taking over the world, but because the serious researchers in AI safety, many of them at leading institutions with impeccable credentials, have identified specific failure modes in the development of advanced AI systems that could, in worst-case scenarios, produce catastrophic outcomes. The specific concern is about value alignment, whether it is possible to build AI systems that reliably pursue the goals humans intend them to pursue, rather than proxy goals that seem equivalent at the time of training but diverge catastrophically in deployment. This is a genuinely hard technical problem, and the pace of AI capability development appears to be outrunning the pace of progress on alignment. None of these risks is certain to produce human extinction. Assigning probabilities to civilizational catastrophe is genuinely difficult, and confident predictions of doom have been wrong before. What the risks share is a common feature. They are all, to varying degrees, products of the same cognitive and social systems that the bottleneck shaped. Nuclear weapons were built by the tribal, US versus them, psychology of nation-states. Pandemics spread more effectively in a globally interconnected world built by the expansive, exploitative psychology of the post-bottleneck dispersal. Climate change is driven by the same inability to manage shared resources sustainably that drove megafauna extinctions. And AI is being developed under competitive pressure by organizations whose incentive structures may not be well aligned with the long-term interests of the species. The bottleneck made us survivors. The question is whether the same psychology that allowed survival in a collapsing world can be redirected toward preventing the collapse of this one. There is a version of optimism that I think is warranted here, not the naive optimism that says we'll be fine because we always have been, but a more hard-edged, evidence-based optimism rooted in what we actually know about human cognitive capacity. We are the only species that has ever understood the causes of its own near extinction, are the only species that has ever sequenced its own genome and read in that sequence the history of an ancient catastrophe. We are the only species that has ever looked at a volcanic ash layer in ancient sediment and thought, that is the thing that almost ended us. We are the only species that has ever identified, in advance, the mechanisms that could produce a comparable outcome in the future, and developed institutions, treaties, and technologies aimed at preventing them. The existence of nuclear arms control treaties is not nothing. The eradication of smallpox, the deliberate elimination of a pathogen that had killed hundreds of millions of human beings over millennia, is one of the most impressive achievements in the history of our species, achieved through exactly the kind of global coordination that our tribal psychology makes difficult. The Montreal Protocol, which reversed the depletion of the ozone layer through international agreement to phase out chlorofluorocarbons, demonstrated that the international community can identify a global chemical threat and coordinate a response to it. These are not small things. They are evidence that human institutions can, under sufficient pressure and with sufficient understanding, produce collective action at scales that exceed what our evolutionary psychology was designed for. The past also offers a darker kind of evidence. Every time a human population has been reduced to a very small number, whether by disease, by conquest, by environmental catastrophe, the survivors have rebuilt. The populations descended from the survivors of the great plagues of the 14th century. The indigenous American survivors of the epidemiological catastrophe of European contact, the populations of Europe that rebuilt after the devastation of 2 world wars. All of these demonstrate the extraordinary demographic resilience of our species. We recover from catastrophe. That is, in a sense, what we are for. It is what the bottleneck built us to do. None of this guarantees anything. Resilience is not immunity. The fact that we survived the Toba bottleneck is not a promise that we will survive whatever comes next. The universe does not make promises. The asteroid that ended the Cretaceous did not spare the dinosaurs because they had been through hard times before. The mechanisms that nearly finished us 74,000 years ago were indifferent to our intelligence, our art, our capacity for love and wonder. The mechanisms that could finish us now would be equally indifferent. What we have that the Toba survivors did not have is knowledge. We know the story. We have read it in the rock and in the genome. We know what the end of everything looks like, because we have found its traces and reconstructed its history. We know that the margin was thin. We know that survival is not guaranteed. We know that the same psychology that carries us also endangers us. That knowledge is not sufficient, but it is necessary, and it is, at this moment in history, something we have that no generation before us possessed. The question of what we do with it is the question of the century. Conclusion: what survives? Let me end not where most discussions of existential risk end, in fear, but where the human story we've been tracing actually begins. A small group of people on a coastline, the sky strange and cold, the world gone quiet in ways that would have been incomprehensible without our knowledge of what had caused it. The animals gone or going, the plants dead or dying, the relatives who had gone inland, silence. Nothing from them now for generations. Here is what I keep coming back to. The people in the refugia did not know they were in the middle of the defining event of their species' history. They had no frame of reference for what was happening. They had never heard the word supervolcano. They had no concept of stratospheric aerosols or volcanic winter. They had no idea that the cold and the dark were the product of an event 8,000 kilometers away, in an island archipelago they had never visited and may not have known existed. They experienced what they experienced: cold, hunger, loss, the shrinking of their world to the circumference of a coastline they knew by heart. And yet, the things they did during that shrinkage, the shellfish collection, the fire building, the tool making, the ochre marking, the child rearing, were not done with any awareness of their world historical significance. They were not preserving the future of humanity. They were doing what humans do, surviving the present moment, taking care of the people around them, making sense of their world in the ways available to them. That is a human scale story, not a species scale story. And I think that matters. These people could not have known that they were the last. They could not have known that the children playing at the edge of the tide line were the ancestors of 8 billion people, that their grandchildren's grandchildren would walk every continent, that whatever art they were making by firelight would eventually lead to the Sistine Chapel and Beethoven and space telescopes looking backward through time. They knew only that there was still shellfish at low tide, that the child who had been sick last month had gotten better, that the old man who knew which roots were edible in winter had passed that knowledge on before he died, that there was still fire, that there were still stories, that the people around them were still the people around them, and they kept going. That is the actual story, not the story of dramatic heroism or visionary foresight or superior intelligence. The story of persistence, of making it through one more day, one more season, one more winter, until the world began to come back. The genetic legacy of that persistence is in you. Every cell of your body carries the molecular signature of what those people went through. The mitochondrial DNA in your cells traces an unbroken maternal line from you backward through every woman who bore a child in every generation since the bottleneck. The Y chromosome in male bodies traces an unbroken paternal line. Your immune system was shaped at a molecular level by the pathogens those people survived. Your anxiety, your in-group loyalty, your capacity for love and fear and grief and wonder, all of it calibrated in the crucible of the worst event in human history. And woven through all of that, detectable now in the lab as a faint signal in your genome, are fragments of the people who didn't make it. The Neanderthal immune variants that may be protecting you against pathogens they learned to fight 300,000 years ago. The Denisovan high-altitude adaptations, the contributions of people whose lineages are otherwise completely gone, whose faces are unknown, whose languages are lost, whose stories were never recorded, but whose genes persist in the living, distributed across the bodies of 8 billion descendants. We are the sum of everyone who survived, but we also carry lightly the trace of everyone who didn't. I think there's something important in that, something that resists the easy narrative of human uniqueness and human dominance, and the inexorability of our success. We did not win an evolutionary competition through superior merit. We survived a catastrophe by a margin so thin that had a few hundred individuals in a few coastal locations made different choices or had different luck, the story ends there. In the ocean, in the cold, unremarked by any future intelligence, because there would be no future intelligence to remark on it. The people who came after the bottleneck, the ones who spread across the world, who hunted the megafauna, who painted caves, who built the first cities, who invented writing and mathematics and music and war, they didn't know how close it had been. The knowledge we have of our own near extinction is not something our ancestors possessed. They had no genetic sequencing, no isotope analysis, no volcanic ash layers to read. They had no idea that the entire world had nearly run out of them. We know. That is what is different about the present moment. We know what a species looks like when it nearly goes extinct. We know what the genetic signature looks like. We know the mechanisms. We know the causes. We have dug up the ash from the volcano that almost finished us, mapped the DNA that tells the story, reconstructed the refugia where the survivors clustered. And we have built, in the course of building a civilization, several new mechanisms capable of doing the same thing. The difference, the only significant difference, is that we see them coming. We have enough self-knowledge now to recognize the risks that our own psychology and technology create. Whether that self-knowledge translates into the collective action required to manage those risks is the central question of the 21st century. Too, is a question that our bottleneck-shaped tribal psychology is poorly equipped to answer easily. Global problems require global solutions, and the cognitive system calibrated for a group of a few dozen people on a coastline does not naturally produce global solidarity. But here is the thing. The same species that made jewelry under existential pressure also built telescopes and sequenced genomes and figured out, from fragments of shell and chips of stone and fractions of a % of genetic divergence, the entire story of its own near extinction. We are, for all our psychological limitations, extraordinarily capable of understanding things that are much bigger than us. Understanding is the first step. It does not guarantee survival. The second step is harder, translating understanding into action at the scale and speed the problems require. We have not yet demonstrated that we can reliably do that. The genetic evidence of our past bottleneck does not tell us whether we will survive our future ones. But we're still here, descended from people who made it through something no one could have predicted or prepared for. Carrying in ourselves the memory of a catastrophe we have only recently learned to read. Alive, by a margin of a few thousand frightened people on a coastline, to ask what comes next. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything.